Next, I am excited to introduce our first panel, Citizen Media and Documentation, moderated by our very own Ivy Dyson. Ivy is a 3L at Berkeley Law, focusing on international human rights and refugee law. Amongst her many amazing accomplishments, Ivy has served as a student researcher for the International Human Rights Law Clinic, has worked with the International Refugee Assistance Project in Jordan, and has been selected as both a Miller Fellow and a Berkeley Human Rights Center Fellow. Thank you so much, Ivy, for moderating our first panel today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jane, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our first panel of our event, Citizen Media and Documentation. It's a great honor to moderate this conversation, especially considering the importance of media and documentation of human rights abuses in our digital age. We have an incredible panel made up of experts in the field, Adebayo Okeowo, Afef Abrugi, and Dr. Alexa Koenig. Under Article 19 of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the right to freedom of expression includes freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media. Given the digital age that we live in, citizen media has been used as an avenue of freedom of expression to expose human rights and humanitarian law abuses around the world. From Syria to Yemen to Myanmar to the End SARS movement in Nigeria, coronavirus coverage, insurrection on the US Capitol, the Black Lives Matter protests in Hong Kong, to name a few, citizen journalists have risked their lives and freedom to document abuses in the hopes of accountability and to shine a light on the impact of abuses on everyday people. This conversation will uncover current issues in citizen media and documentation, including how media can be preserved and used for criminal justice, how we best prepare and protect citizen journalists, and what can be done about government and corporate interference in citizen journalism, and how we can promote ethical media sharing when it is hard to understand what is fact and what is fiction. We'll first start with a conversation between our panelists, but then open it up at the end to audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please share it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now I would like to introduce our incredible panelists. Adebayo Okeowo is a human rights lawyer, the Africa Program Manager at Witness, and a fellow of the Center for Human Rights Science at Carnegie Mellon University. His work explores the intersection between human rights and technology through his work and research. Adebayo has spoken at TEDx Pretoria on the visual disruption of injustice, and though a self-taught photographer and filmmaker, he has won 2 human rights photography awards and has had his work exhibited in Italy, Mauritius, and South Africa. Afef Abrugi is a researcher, writer, and consultant working at the intersection of technology and human rights. She has worked as an editor for Advox, a project by Global Voices specializing in reporting on the intersection of technology and human rights in the Global South. From 2018 to 2020, she was a research analyst for Ranking Digital Rights, a nonprofit research initiative that works to promote freedom of expression and privacy on the internet by creating global standards and incentives for companies to respect and protect users' rights. And finally, Dr. Alexa Koenig is the executive director of the Human Rights Center and a lecturer at UC Berkeley School of Law. She co-founded the UC Berkeley Human Rights Investigations Lab, which trains students and professionals to use social media and other online open source information to support human rights advocacy and accountability. Alexa co-chairs and is a member of several prominent human rights and technology organizations. Her most recent book, which she co-edited, is Digital Witness, using open source information for human rights investigation, documentation, and accountability, which was published in 2020. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for joining us. And I'd like to open it up to a question for all of you. Who is the citizen journalist and documentarian, and what is their role? And we'll start with Adebayo.
Thank you, Ivy, and hello to everyone who has joined. It's a pleasure to be here. Glad to be on this panel. I mean, that question, I think the way I would approach answering that question would be to kind of compare, there's a sort of distinction and some similarities between who a citizen journalist is in the global north and in the global south. so I think the best way to explain citizen media and documentation would be to analyze those similarities and differences. And I think I'll just start by first of all saying that most times, first of all, citizen media are those pieces of videos and photographs that have been captured by people you could call citizen journalists, and in some other cases, digital witnesses, like was referred to in the book that Alexa, Sam Doubley, and Dara Murray and others wrote. But these people are the similarity where whatever part of the world you're in, whether you're in the United States or in Syria, a similarity is that they usually, most times, are accidental witnesses who happen to be on the scene of a human rights violation, and then they whip out their phone or their camera to document it. And this also, I would pivot quickly to talk about how Witness as an organization that I work for came into being, because what informed the starting of Witness by Peter Gabriel back in 1992 was initially what he saw when he went on a trip, the visual evidence he saw of the atrocities when he went on a trip with other colleagues in the human rights sector. He came back and he felt that there was a need to document every form of evidence that comes out and to give everybody, as many people as possible, cameras in their hands. But that didn't take off until 1992, after the brutal beating of Rodney King, which was accidentally captured by someone on the balcony of his home using a camcorder. And this predated the era of Facebook or cell phones. But what has now become different, and why there's a spike and ubiquity in the use of citizen media, is because more people now have phones. So people are using the medium and method of cell phones to capture evidence of human rights abuses and to share that on social media in a bid to seek justice and accountability. And so this might also be a perfect time to talk about how this new wave of human rights documentation has become important, because someone who I would refer to the work of a previous special rapporteur, I'm forgetting his name now, but he talked about the 3 generations of human rights fact-finding. And he mentioned that, you know, at the first generation, you had those who were in suits and international organizations. At the UN, for instance, they would be the ones to be on the field. Whenever there was an atrocity, they would be there and they would investigate. It takes time. They probably use black and white images to communicate, but eventually they sought some form of accountability. And then the second generation became your international organizations like the Amnesty International and the likes, also still going through the rigorous process of flying into a conflict area to gather the evidence. But however, that has changed now with this third generation of human rights fact finders who are called citizen journalists, who are using the tool of their phones to capture these pieces of evidence. However, there are challenges, and this is where sometimes I would quickly mention some of the distinctions that you have in between the global north and the global south. One of which is the problem with amplification. And so it doesn't just stop at capturing the pieces of evidence. There's a need for people to see it and the right eyes to see it so that it can push towards accountability. Unfortunately, we've seen that there's greater amplification that comes as a result of sometimes digital penetration, again, media present in most global north countries versus global south. So while all these people are courageously documenting on the ground and trying to have their voices heard, some get to have their voices heard more than others, but that doesn't make the atrocities or the evidence being captured by others less significant. And I'll give you a quick example, which some people might be very familiar with. In 2015, you remember Je suis Charlie, the Charlie Hebdo killing in France. And the same week within which that killing was happening, the same week within that, when that killing happened, you had world leaders, presidents marching on the streets of France and, you know, standing in solidarity and saying this is an injustice that must be pushed back against. The world was sort of made to stop to pay attention to the visual image that had come out of that killing. But contrast that with Nigeria, in the northern part of Nigeria, where there was a massacre in a village called Baga, and the world didn't hear about it until much later. And it happened in the same week. Both were atrocious, but one received more attention than the other. And these are some of the concerns that would have to be addressed, even as we probably, you know, move into a future where we want to seek accountability for every form of human rights abuses. But again, whatever part of the world you are, as a citizen journalist, all of them face certain risks. You know, it might be in varying degrees, because I would argue that the risk being faced by people in Syria, for instance, cannot be equated to the risk being faced by people in New York. Again, it's debatable. However, there are some protections also that come into being for citizen journalists in places like the United States, where they have a right to record. Whereas in some other countries, in places in Africa, for instance, there isn't that right. It's not constitutionally provided for, and you can actually get into real trouble for daring to whip out your phone or camera to document a human rights abuse. So I would stop there because I feel that there's a lot more to still talk about. But bottom line is this generation of human rights fact finders have really helped to push forward the envelope of accountability. And we've seen, because of their daring documentation and courageous videos, we have seen accountability brought to the fore in many, many, many cases, both international and domestic cases.
Thank you, Adebayo. And hopefully we'll be able to get back later on in the conversation about how we can address those issues of inequality in protection of journalists, but also in whose voices get heard. I'd like to pass it to Afef to talk about her opinion. Who is a citizen journalist or a documentarian today?
Thank you. Well, I mean, the simple definition is really, or how I see it, is really anyone who lacks, let's say, professional experience and training as a journalist, but still puts on the journalist hat from time to time or often to disseminate information using either social media or blogs or any other tools that are accessible to them. It can be, an accidental really witness, someone witnessing police abuse and filming that and sharing it with the public, or it could be a protester at a protest deciding to do a live stream or a report about the protest itself. But in certain contexts, citizen journalism is sort of overlapping a lot with activism, and I'm talking here about contexts where there is a crackdown on human rights and political repression, where the flow of information is obstructed, media and press freedoms are really restricted, and in those contexts, a lot of activists also become themselves citizen journalists, reporting from the ground about what's happening, and their role in these cases is really crucial to informing the public and to disseminate essential information about what's happening. These contexts can be really dangerous for professional journalists, and even more so for citizen journalists who may lack the resources and training on how to report safely from the ground, which places them at great risks as they fulfill this essential role. And just in my work at the intersection of technology and human rights, I have been researching and reporting on the different aspects technology impacts human rights, and there are a few trends in the digital spaces that sort of threaten or at least obstruct the work of citizen journalists, among them network shutdowns and the increasing role of algorithms in moderating content, but also government prosecutions of journalists, states of emergencies, including those enacted during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will get back to that more in details, or in a little bit share more details about this later when we discuss the challenges.
Thank you so much. Alexa, I'd like to turn to you now to both maybe reflect on what our other panelists had to say, but also to get your take. I know that you do work looking at how this documentation can be used for prosecution and to access justice. So I'd be interested to hear what do you think about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for including me in this conversation. I really like what Adebayo and FF said about the citizen journalist really being an accidental witness. I think one thing we're also looking at are the ways that these accidental witnesses who may find themselves at a scene of an atrocity are also sharing that information to what some people in the field are calling accidental archives. And basically the social media sites that have been proliferating across the globe, and of course use has been increasing at the same time that we're seeing a broader array of opportunities and different kinds of platforms that can be available for people to help share what they've just experienced out with the world. As you mentioned, a big subset of the people that we're engaging with are those who are really hoping that their experiences and their documentation has impact on justice and accountability processes. We, of course, know that the majority of incidents are never going to find any form of justice in a court of law. It's too expensive. It's too time consuming. There's the issues Bio brought up about who actually gets heard and who has the ability to get their the cases and the issues that they care about actually witnessed by a broader audience. But I do think we also have new opportunities at this moment where there's been such a profound shift in how people communicate. Not always, but in some instances, in some geographies, and for some people in some contexts, that to not be paying attention to these new mechanisms of communication would be meaning that we're potentially missing a big piece of the story. So at the Human Rights Center, we've for the last 25 years been trying to think through how scientific and legal opportunities can help to get some form of justice and accountability. Increasingly, there's been a really big arc on looking at digital technologies for more successful prosecution. And this has been a really collaborative process where I think we've been helping to bring people together, as have other groups in this space, to have workshops, to think through how everything like the rise of drone technology with the increased ability and decreased cost of accessing satellite imagery can be paired up with the videos and the photographs that people are capturing of what they're experiencing on the ground to hopefully create stronger evidentiary packages. One of the big challenges that we were set up to begin to address was really why so few prosecutions for really egregious crimes, ones that the media may or may not have amplified, and where we may or may not know the who, what, when, where, why, and how of what happened, why so many of them fall apart at relatively early stages of prosecution. And often it's because the law demands such a high evidentiary threshold to actually get information introduced as evidence and then weighted appropriately by courts. So one issue, for example, at the International Criminal Court was that for a while back in 2011, 2012, judges were not allowing prosecutions to proceed because they were saying that the prosecution was over-relying on witness testimony. And although witnesses will always be at the heart of any successful prosecution, they didn't see that there was enough corroborating information to help give those stories the weight that they needed to meet the evidentiary thresholds. So that's where I think the drone technology, the photographs, et cetera, can really come in to help supplement what survivors are saying and also be a check on some of our interpretations of what has actually taken place. In 2016 at the Human Rights Center, we founded the Investigations Lab to train students and professionals how to use that kind of information that was increasingly showing up on social media platforms in order to help support the work of 3 sets of end users in doing their fact-finding and their verification of those facts. And that was investigative reporters and other journalists, human rights NGOs who are increasingly reliant on that information as well, and also legal investigators. I think we've seen a real wave, certainly since 2015, of legal investigations beginning to increasingly incorporate that information. And here in the United States, I think with the events of January 6th and the attacks on Congress, we're seeing a broader awareness across civil society of the true impact that can have. I think the pandemic we're all finding ourselves in right now is also really forcing us to think through how can we tap into information remotely to ensure that sites of conflict and areas that may be less heard, particularly right now, actually do find the kinds of justice and accountability that they both need and deserve.
Thank you so much, Alexa. I think something that I'm hearing from everyone right now is kind of the idea that there are voices that aren't heard. And whether that's because, you know, what has been captured on video can't be used in prosecution, or because of the digital divide, or because of crackdowns on speech and digital activism. So I'd kind of like to turn back to Afef a bit to ask about about these crackdowns, about censorship from governments and also from social media, what we're seeing right now in this space, and perhaps what can be done about it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll start with network shutdowns, which is a big problem, and also because an increasing number of governments are resorting to this tactic to crack down on speech, crack down on dissent. But also the problem is that these shutdowns, I mean, first of all, they are disproportionate measures, and they are never justified under human rights law. A number of UN resolutions, but also regional resolutions have condemned these shutdowns, and they said that they are never justified. So these shutdowns, they often usually happen and coincide with an environment of political repression and a broader crackdown on human rights and the media, and they also take place during events that are very important, including national elections or regional elections, but also during conflict, during protests. So they often happen at times when really the role of journalists, citizen journalists, and those documenting human rights abuses is crucial in ensuring the public is access to credible information, but also to help counter mis and this information. This is, of course, problematic because shutdowns prevent citizen journalists from doing their work, including uploading and disseminating their work and contacting sources. But they can also be dangerous in the sense that it prevents journalists and citizen journalists and human rights documentarians from understanding what's happening around them, which can be really dangerous during certain events that such as violent protests or conflicts. That's the first issue I wanted to talk about a little bit. The second is the platform moderation of content, and specifically through algorithms. Of course, platforms, they rely on algorithms to help moderate the troves of content that get posted every day on these services, and particularly content that that can lead to situations of real life harm, such as extremist or terrorist content. The problem here is that while automated tools, I mean, they may be trained to assess when a video is violent or graphic, they are not necessarily capable of understanding in the context in which those videos were posted. For example, in 2017, when YouTube adjusted its content moderation algorithms, thousands of videos that documented war crimes and human rights abuses during the conflict in Syria were taken down. This problem is still continues today. In last year, for example, dozens of Facebook accounts belonging to Tunisian, Syrian, and Palestinian activists and journalists, some of them also were involved or are involved, or they work on documenting human rights abuses, were deactivated. Most of the accounts, I think, they were later reinstated, but when these accounts were suspended, they weren't, the users or these activists, they weren't giving reasons from the platform on why their accounts were suspended. Experts believe that this is the result of algorithms. The algorithms used, they suspected that these accounts may have been involved in posting extremist content or being involved in coordinated campaigns. And this highlights the need for platforms to be transparent about how they are using these algorithms in content moderation, but also to give users mechanisms to to appeal those decisions and to also test their algorithms and to ensure that there is some form of appropriate human review of those decisions when they are made. Quickly to touch on also like the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the pandemic has many governments in certain countries and regions, they have been using the pandemic as a pretext to further crack down on critical voices, independent media, and once again, the role of citizen journalists here is very important, and the restrictions imposed as a result of the pandemic, they affect their work, and they can also put these citizen journalists in danger. For example, when there are states of emergencies, it can be really dangerous or risky for journalists to be doing their work. We've seen a number of governments also passing bills to sort of allegedly to curtail the spread of misinformation during this health crisis. But once again, we've seen that it's also a pretext. For example, the Algerian government last year, they adopted the fake news bill. They passed the fake news bill, and allegedly, again, once again, it's to fight or to counter misinformation during like the public health lockdown, but also other catastrophes. The passing of the bill coincided with a broader crackdown in Algeria against the pro-democracy movement that started in 2019. So that's just one example that I wanted to share. In terms of what can be done, I think it's really about a range of tactics that need to be adopted, depending on the context of each country and each region, but also which group is working on these tactics. I think it's very important to engage with platforms when it comes to content moderation, and also it's important for platforms to do more in order to understand the impact of their policies and practices on groups such as citizen journalists and groups working on documenting human rights. I think we also need to innovate more. There is a need to do more innovation, including developing independent, open source, secure tools for human rights documentation, and also to improve existing tools, for example, to support offline documentation when internet shutdowns happen. More safety training is also needed for citizen journalists in order not to endanger themselves. And this has to be comprehensive safety. It's about how to safely report from the ground, but also digital security and how to ensure the safety of sources. I think that's very important. In terms of government policies, this again also depends on the margin of freedom available for the people doing or trying to sort of improve or help citizen journalists and people working on human rights documentation. Whenever possible, it's good to engage, I think, with politicians and MPs and to push for laws that protect freedom of expression and information in the digital space, but also offline. In terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it's also important to engage with the different United Nations mechanisms to call on governments to respect their commitments, but also to call on them not to keep the policy that they started during the pandemic, to keep those policies lasting after the pandemic is over. And most importantly, I think whenever needed, I think it's important to keep speaking out in support of those being prosecuted and harassed for doing their work as citizen journalists or documentarians.
Thank you, Afef. I'd like to give Adebayo or Alexa the chance to follow up on some of the points that Afef made, if you would like to.
I'd be happy to jump in on the issue because I think a lot of what is raised is something that we've been trying to grapple with among many organizations globally around the ethics of using online open source information or the information that people post to public sites with ideally the hope that their perspectives and their insights end up feeding into some form of accountability, whether it's accountability in the court of public opinion for diplomatic purposes or in legal courts to get some kind of legal justice. And I think that really comes down to an overriding importance on not just thinking through what we do, but how we do it and whose voices, again, to go back to the original question, we're hearing from. One of the areas that I've been trying to research with a colleague, Ulik Egan, is how can some of this content that's being put out there by citizen media and citizen journalists be useful for getting justice for sexual violence crimes? Sexual violence is one of the hardest atrocities or crimes to actually get justice for. It's notoriously difficult to investigate. And I think there's a real concern among people who are using this online content to try and build evidentiary cases that certain kinds of cases may increasingly find justice to the exclusion of others and make the really difficult ones even harder to prosecute. We've interviewed investigators from around the world, and one of the things that we're hearing from a lot of specialists in gender-related issues and sexual violence-related issues is that it's already tough to get their cases through prosecution because judges can be reluctant to rely on the voices of survivors to the exclusion of other forms of information, but there's often just not a lot of digital documentation. I think another finding, though, of ours was that there actually is a lot of more digital documentation in some of these cases than you would maybe initially think, but that investigators are not trained in the terminology and the ways that people post information online that can help them get to that information. So, for example, in interviewing one investigator, she was talking about how there's a special lexicon to a lot of sexual violence related issues. And in her case, she was working on a trafficking case and the terminology would change weekly. And one week, basically trafficking in a woman might be called to get a cup of coffee. The next week it might be to grab a key. And so really making sure that investigators understand deeply the ways language is playing out in a particular context, which really requires, particularly if these are international investigators, deep partnerships with local communities who are the only communities that can help build that lexicon and help explain to a broader public what things mean in context. And I think that gets back at some of what FF was talking about how dumb machines can be at understanding context. And I think it also gets to these issues of bias. Yvonne McDermott and Dara Murray in the UK are looking a lot at how biases are influencing what we see and how we interpret that information, whether they're the technical bias, where what we put in a search bar on some kind of a Google search, for example, the order of the words is going to radically change what we'll be exposed to. And that's just one form of algorithmic bias. So we put in Paris Hilton, we're going to get the noted celebrity. We put in Hilton Paris, we're going to get information about hotels. And then when we think about how algorithms are increasingly modifying what we see to what advertisers have as their priorities, or to our unique fingerprints in our online engagement, it really means that what I'm getting access to may be very different than what other people are seeing in a very different part of the world or who have very different identities and online identities in particular. And then, of course, it also gets into human bias. So I think one issue that's really of concern right now is this issue of confirmation bias, how international investigators might want a particular outcome to be true. Really thinking through how do we mediate that so that they're not just cherry picking information, given the wealth of information online. People can find plenty of digital data that will back up kind of their perspective on a particular world event. It's often very politicized content. So, what are the processes that we put in place to really interrogate the information that people put forward, particularly in courts of law, to say, what are we missing in this conversation and whose voices, whether it's based on age or gender or geography, that we really need to fully understand what has taken place. The last thing I might say on ethics is just also thinking through, as FF brought up, the physical security of people on the ground, the digital security and the psychological security. Pulling together these narratives using digital content that citizen media have posted online can be in some ways very sexy and exciting. It can be deeply emotive. But I think we really have to ask of the people who are publishing that information out and amplifying those narratives, how they're doing what they do and for what end purpose. If it's just to show off what we're now able to do with digital technology, that could have some really negative ramifications for people on the ground and these unintended consequences that we should be thinking through before we actually repost information online. The psychological impact too, when we're talking about citizen media, professional journalists have codes of ethics that really mediate how they document something, like what they show, say of a person who's deceased, whether they show their face, whether they show the injury, and that has evolved over time. I think in the citizen media space, and particularly with dealing with brand new open source investigators, the same codes of ethics haven't matured in the same way. You're likely to get the most emotive content online, the most graphic content online, which can have negative impacts for the dignity of the deceased individual and or their families or communities, but can also have a really negative ramification for the people who are often looking at large quantities of graphic material in the aftermath of an incident like that, and may not be trained. And I think what's beginning to evolve is sort of a set methodology for protecting yourself psychologically if you are the investigator from being so bombarded with that content. At the very end, I'll just say, I remember talking to one very noted human rights luminary who came to visit our center, and she said, thank goodness, at least as open source investigators, you're far from danger. And while from a physical perspective, that's true, I think from a psychological perspective, that's not always true. There's amazing research that's been done looking at drone operators who are in an analogous situation where they're far from the site of atrocity, but we're finding that the psychological impact on them is similar to having gone to war. And it's because in some ways their experience of that conflict, the volume of atrocity that they're facing, how close up they're able to get now with digital technologies to see the aftermath of an attack, all of that is stuff I think we need to grapple with as a broader community as we advance this space.
I think I want to just jump in quick to add a few thoughts to what Alex and Afif have said. So, prior to this moment, I know that many of us would agree that it's been very difficult and almost impossible to alter what you see on video. It's been believed that, it's been said a number of times that seeing is believing. And even though Photoshop existed way before now, we are unfortunately in that era where video is becoming very easy to manipulate. And that is one of the challenges we're seeing with citizen media and documentation. So before now, it was easy to just tell people that, go document and film and capture these atrocities and present your video, it will be believed. But there's something at Witness that we are beginning to, frame as the deep fake argument. It's a deep fake argument. And that is how that with the increase in misinformation, disinformation, we are seeing how people could just easily excuse any video of an atrocity or a violation as it being deep fake and to undermine the truth and to avoid accountability. Even though we've seen it increasingly more in the context of political uses, but we're also seeing it filter into more very prominent case scenarios. For instance, in 2019, at the beginning of 2019, the president of Gabon, the country of Gabon itself almost suffered a coup. And that's because a video of him appeared online that was deemed to be a deep fake video of his. And because of that belief that it was a deep fake video, the military went all out and carried out a coup. And then the president had to come out and say, no, it wasn't a deep fake. And because we've seen that excuse over and over again, it also has then become what many authoritarian governments would use to avoid any form of accountability. We saw that happen a lot of times with the NSAR's protest in Nigeria that happened last year, where many videos that were being pushed out by the citizen journalists were being dubbed as deepfake, and the government was carrying out a disinformation campaign to undermine the truth. So at Witness, we are trying to see how to continue to work with platforms. We've had workshops in Malaysia, in Brazil, in South Africa, consulting and speaking with people in the communities and other people who are at the forefront of this kind of work to see what we can do. Whereas it might be fancy for Hollywood to be able to manipulate something to make it more cinematic, it has implications for human rights accountability. And so one of the concerns that we're hearing and people are raising is how about we work on media literacy for citizen journalists and how people can spot deepfakes themselves, and how can we also develop tools that can help to identify deepfakes and counter deepfakes, or how people can take more responsibility for when they have shared a form of deepfake, because then there are other use cases of deepfakes that people would argue are very, very positive. You know, we've seen deepfake videos being used positively by some campaigns to promote certain form of issues, like in the case of stopping malaria, we've seen that being used. But there are some of those instances, however, there are many more cases where it's being used for nefarious purposes. So having tools that can be built and developed to counter or identify deepfakes might be a way to go. Countries like China are going the hard way, which, well, one is still trying to deliberate whether that's the perfect approach to it, because then they have instituted laws that says that you might face jail term if you post a deepfake online and you do not tag it as being a deepfake. But policy and all of those things without also impacting the freedom of expression might be things to consider, because it's important that we do not become too skeptical of every video that we see online, because then the people who are taking so much effort and courage to document those atrocities will be left with nothing, because everybody dubs their efforts as maybe a manipulated video and something of the sort.
Thank you for that, Adebayo. And I actually wanted to follow up on a point that you made earlier. You had talked about the lack of physical protection for journalists in certain parts of the world. And I wanted to get your take on, you know, how do we encourage the protection of journalists in areas where they're not physically protected? Because I know we've kind of talked about mental health issues that journalists might face. And then I also was interested to hear more about your ideas on how to encourage voices from all around the world to be heard at an equal playing field, and also how those voices can be better used to promote human rights.
Okay, absolutely. So first of all, maybe to the first question in relation to protection for journalists. I'm not holding the fort for journalists, I'm holding the fort for citizen journalists. So I would argue that even though journalists themselves have challenges with protection, you know, citizen journalists are more at risk because they don't even have to begin with, they don't even have the institutional backing that somebody from BBC or CNN would have if they're going into any space. Even if a journalist or a media representative from any of these big media companies gets arrested, the lawyers, the company will swoop in and get them, support and get them released. However, we've had cases where citizen journalists themselves, if they do get arrested, unfortunately, that may be the last thing we would hear of them. So clearly, there's greater protection that needs to be had for citizen journalists. And one of the ways that we are also trying to push for that would be, first of all, to establish that there's a right to film, to record police violence, military atrocity, state violence of any sort. If we can come to that agreement and make it as an established right that is duly protected, then we can have more covering for these brave people who step out to film from time to time. Because it's not in all countries that you have that right being respected. And Witness has advocated for that at different stages, including having it introduced into general comments by the United Nations. And we're getting there, we're making progress. But as we know, soft law is not as great as hard law. So we want to have it into constitutions, into treaties where the right to record, because if we do not have those recordings, there is absolutely, there's not as much strength for us to push for accountability. And this, I'll quickly, reference the example of the war crimes that were committed back in World War II. And during the trials, and I'm sure this is something Alexa might even have spoken about, so sorry, Alexa, if I'm preempting you, you would find the film played a very integral part in the trials back then. And the films that were presented actually were films that were instructed to be captured by General Eisenhower, who, when he came across the atrocities of at the concentration camps, he instructed that media houses and members of Congress be brought in to witness exactly these atrocities. and be put on film, just in case somebody down the line might say that it was all some sort of an attempt to counter the narrative. And so, you know, back in the day, of course, people had to travel, they were on phones, and then they got those things documented. How much more now? So the importance of video can never be overstated. And that's why we must really work towards getting the right to record recognized. And of course, in terms of quickly responding to your question about increasing the equality as to voices being heard, I think it's the responsibility of everybody across the world to ensure that, you know, we look over the fence at what is happening. Stuff is going down right now in Myanmar, in India, the farmers' protests, the farmers' riots, and things like that. How many people are aware of these things? Are we just stuck in our own bubbles? Because there's a lot of work to still be done in other parts of the world. And, you know, I think it's one of a prominent human rights advocate that once said that injustice in any part of the world is injustice in a part of the world is injustice in the rest of the world. So we all must work towards amplifying the voices of all. Media plays a very critical role that they need to also focus on decentering the global north especially, and look into amplifying voices, especially from the global south. I think I would stop there because I know I had a short time to give that intervention. I could always expatiate further.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to ask one last panel question and also allow everyone to respond to what Adebayo said. But I would just like to remind our audience to drop some questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, because we'll move on to asking audience questions in a little bit. One final question I want to ask all of you is, and maybe you've already touched on this, but this is kind of a chance for you to dig deeper into what you've been saying. What do you think are some next steps that we can do to improve or bolster citizen media and documentation in the human rights space, whether it's this year or in the next 5 years? What do you think we can do? And I'll start with Alexa.
Maybe I'll pick up on one of the challenges that Bio raised and that was already mentioned, which is the challenge of misinformation and disinformation, and people increasingly being able to discount the work of citizen journalists to get accurate information out to the world by saying, oh, but that's not true. They clearly made this up, or they staged it, or they created it with an algorithm, et cetera. I think one of the things that we're really hoping is to help bring some standards and some methods to the legal investigation space, so that we can have very clear protocols around how the authenticity and the accuracy of citizen media is evaluated, particularly when we're talking about court purposes where the evidentiary standards are so high and so difficult to meet. And so one of the things that we launched with the UN Human Rights Office in December was the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations, which was something that was created through partnerships with more than 150 people who contributed to what kinds of guidelines, what kinds of protocols do we need in this space to help gain legitimacy and actually support and give greater weight to what citizens are saying is happening around the world. And that will eventually be launched this summer in all of the languages of the United Nations, so that hopefully it can begin to have a broader global impact and be a tool that communities and legal practitioners around the world can be using to strengthen their own investigations. A big piece of it is how do we minimize bias by having these really clear protocols and steps that we have to go through to evaluate every piece of content, and to maximize the accuracy, because I think just one or two pieces of content that are really critical to a case or to a conversation that's happening in the international community or in national or local communities, you establish that it's wrong, you establish that it's faked. I think all of a sudden you're undermining and undercutting an entire field of work and the incredible and extraordinary documentation efforts that citizens around the world are going through. A lot of our work on the protocol really arose from lawyers who were practicing at sites of conflict or close to them, who were increasingly being sent information from people's cell phones, the photos and videos that they'd captured, or were finding information on social media sites relevant to the atrocity that they were investigating. And they were calling us and saying, like, what do I do with this digital content? I don't know how to, like, where to put it to preserve some form of chain of custody so that I can establish its integrity in court. I don't know what to tell the people who are sending me this information about how it might be used. And I don't know how to interrogate it myself in terms of its authenticity and its reliability. So I really do think that we took kind of all the questions that were being thrown at us, that were being thrown at our partners around the world and other places to try and help to bring some systematicity to it. I also think out of that, to get to the challenge of whose voices are heard and whose are silenced, one of the annexes in it is what's called a digital landscape analysis. And it's just basically a simple toolkit to get at people, again, to ask systematically, where are people relevant to this particular atrocity actually communicating? And if it turns out they're actually communicating face to face, it may be that these digital investigations are kind of a waste of people's time and energy. But we can also ask the question of how does communication vary in that community by, again, age and ethnicity and gender and geography? Is there a rural-urban divide in terms of who has access to the internet and whose voices may actually be getting out there into digital spaces? Are there also differences in terms of where people are communicating? So certainly for my daughter, who's a young teenager, she's posting everything to TikTok. Well, I might be on Twitter and my mom might be on Facebook. And I think that's an under-recognized differential in terms of, so if we want more women's voices, if we want more local voices, we really need to do that careful and thoughtful work. And as Northern and Western investigators, not just go to the platforms we know and the places that we're comfortable with, but really push ourselves and again, be in partnership. The final thing I would say is I think we have to kind of reshift some of the incentives in the space. And certainly from a financial perspective even. So I think right now there's a real sense of competition that's rewarded among NGOs. There are certain NGOs who are favored by the major foundations, et cetera, because of where they're located and what they've been doing for a long time. I don't think the answer is always to stop funding those, but I think it's about beginning to incentivize collaborations and these deep grounded partnerships. So if let Northern organizations invest the time and cost and money in the screw ups that are inevitably going to happen of bringing new technologies into an area of practice, and let them bear some of that burden, but also make sure that whatever happens next is really being driven by people who are closest, whether it's in the North or the South, to the actual phenomena that are taking place. The investigations will be stronger as a result. And I think there will be less risk of actually kind of capturing and extracting information to bring it into conversations that are of interest to the global North without ensuring that this is actually responsive to a broader set of needs. So I guess I'll just end on that. I would love to see the funders really incentivize collaborative work and deep partnerships, because I think it's every link in the chain of accountability, from capturing the content to posting it online or sending it to someone else to getting it into the courtroom, that has to be strengthened to have greatest impact.
I'll pass it to Adebayo.
Sure. So thanks, Alexa. There are a number of things that the Human Rights Center at Berkeley do that also we are passionate about at Witness. Witness is a lot more about amplifying the voices in those communities. And one of the things definitely that we believe can continue to be done would be capacity building and training for many of those people who are, taking this risk to document human rights violations, because like Alexa has mentioned before, the standards for admissibility or for this videos being considered as compelling in an international, before an international tribunal are pretty high. And same would apply in most domestic courts. And you see that many times sometimes when you think of citizen media, people associate it as grainy footage. It's very shaky, unstable, it's blurry. To the point that some time ago, some people wanted to highlight a problem in Syria, the problem that's ongoing in Syria, and they decided to release a video which they actually created, and they made that video to be a bit shaky and unstable, and they put it out there, and people believed it to be true. Unfortunately, it happened to be a made-up video. And the reason why I bring that example up is because they went for the typical shaky footage and people fell for it. So we should get to the point where we should not assume that every grainy citizen media has to be grainy and unstable, because we just think that these people are not professional enough to capture quality and effective videos and pictures of atrocities. And so that's something we want to work on to ensure that increasingly more and more people are able to capture the right kind of elements in that video. It's not just about holding up a phone and filming the scene. What are the key elements you need to capture to prove that there's been this atrocity, because of course there are elements of a crime that have to be proven, who was the perpetrator, who was the victim, what was the act of atrocity being committed, was there a commander in space giving the orders? Depending on the scenario, there are certain things you should be capturing. And as somebody who also has worked in the space of digital verification, I know that in the past, and the Human Rights Lab also at Berkeley does do a lot of work on this. When videos are received from these online sources, some of the challenges in being able to establish the truth and veracity of these videos is that you would have to do a lot of work to first identify where it was shot, what was going on. And so citizen journalists, we need to increase capacity, we need to improve training, and that is an area that Witness is, of course, working on. And if we could do more of this, not turning them necessarily into professional journalists who would be able to go film for Al Jazeera, but people who can, when they pick up their phone, walk through the basic technicalities. Again, it's tricky because the last thing somebody who is in a very volatile situation would want to be doing is to try to remember, okay, what was page 5 saying of that training manual. So, but it's still important nonetheless to have imbibed these processes, and when it's time to be able to document that atrocity, to be able to do the right thing. Of course, we're also advocating to tech platforms to work around the things that Afef has mentioned, the takedowns and some of those things, because people's truth are on this platform and algorithms get it wrong many times. And so there should be nuanced approaches to this issue. I'm glad that Facebook, for instance, has the oversight board now that would look into some of the decisions that their algorithms or even their own personnel take in terms of takedowns. But a lot more still needs to be done, and organizations like Mnemonic and Syrian Archives have been doing a lot of incredible work around that space. Those are people we should continue to support. And I think with those things, there's still a lot more that could be done, in terms of court and all of that, but I think those would get us closer to accountability and justice.
Thank you, Adebayo, and I'll ask Afef for your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so definitely capacity building in terms of, again, comprehensive safety. It's very important. And as my co-panelists mentioned, in terms of capacity building, in terms of ensuring that these citizen journalists can be safe, because they do not enjoy the same protections or support that traditional journalists have, and also in terms of psychological support. That's very important. Funders also need to put in more resources into developing and improving existing tools that citizen journalists use for documentation, open source documentation tools that are developed by partners that are trusted in the community. That's very important. In terms of social media, or in terms of content moderation, what's important is to keep scrutinizing like the actions and practices and policies of commercial social media platforms, and to keep in mind that these platforms, it's their priority, it's not human rights. Their priority is to make revenues, and the policies and that they put in place, and the measures they put in place that reflect that that's what they are after. It's not, despite the fact that these platforms have been enabling citizen journalists and to sort of reach out to audiences, to contact sources, but it's important to keep that in mind and to keep pushing for these platforms to be more transparent about their policies, including the role of algorithms in moderating content, once again, to make sure that users in general and citizen journalists, of course, have access to appeal mechanisms to publish transparency reports that are really transparent, not just transparency reports that include just a little bit of data. We took down, I don't know how many pieces of content here using algorithms. That's not enough. We need really companies to be more transparent about that, and to listen to the people who are impacted by their policies. Not just listen, but to actually try to take actions and to try to understand the risks and to try to mitigate those risks, to do human rights impact assessments when they launch a new algorithms and to test those algorithms to better understand their impact, and also to ensure appropriate human review when algorithms take actions.
Thank you to our panel for some wonderful thoughts on how we can really improve this space and protect citizen journalists, preserve documentation of mass atrocities. I'm going to move on to our audience questions. We've got quite a lot, so I'll try to get to as many as I can. I apologize to the audience if I can't get to your questions. But we have two questions actually regarding deepfakes. And I think I would like to go back to Afef for the first question. Do you think there's a possibility that future algorithms will be able to automatically filter out deepfakes? And what is the risk of using AI for this?
I'm afraid I cannot answer that because I have not studied deepfakes. So yeah, I think I'm unable to answer that. Maybe someone else on the panel can.
I could try. I mean, technology keeps advancing, and if there's anything we've seen is that some things we thought not possible are becoming possible. So I definitely believe that there will be a time when algorithms will be able to filter out deepfakes. Deepfakes, I mean, they are getting better by the day themselves. Initially, they were easy to spot because many deepfakes, one of the ways you could identify a deepfake back then, and maybe some examples still exist now, was that the image the subject doesn't blink their eye. So it was going to be so obvious for somebody who paid attention and knew what to look for to know that this was a deep fake. But then of course, the more you create the solution and you spot the weaknesses, the people who do these things would improve their own tactics too. So deep fakes now blink like every other human being does. So that you can't use that to spot it. So I know that with technology, you can expect there will be a time that algorithms would be trained to spot deepfakes. But the harm in that, as we've seen again with graphic content takedown, is that they would get it wrong in some instances. Because like I mentioned earlier, there have been many positive use cases of deepfakes. Again, Hollywood uses it for cinematic videos, but we've also seen human rights organizations use deepfakes to promote certain campaigns. And so if that is also being used for positive reasons, we might want to be careful as to how we also take down every form of deepfake and administer it in a very cautious and nuanced manner. But yes, I'm sure algorithms will be able to do it at some time, but they might get it wrong too. Maybe we might be able to perfect that along the line. I do not know, but media literacy is one of the ways we feel would be the right way to go, so as to empower more people to be able to spot and identify deepfakes so that the harmful ones do not get shared and cause more problems, both online and offline.
If I can just piggyback on that super quickly, I think all the points that Bayo just raised are so incredibly important. But I do also think this focus on this last point that you made about media literacy is so critical. That's one of the reasons why in the protocol, we kind of put together a really almost formulaic process that everyone can use to go through and check the veracity of a piece of content that they encounter, because the technology is changing so fast and a lot of the earlier tells are no longer relevant. So for example, the 3-step process is usually you're going to check to see if there's any technological or technical information like EXIF data or anything like that that can help you understand what technology was actually used to generate this information. I mean, ideally in a court of law, you have forensic experts who can do a deep analysis on all of the underlying content that you might have at your disposal. But there are everyday tools that are open source at this point that are really easy, like Chrome plugins, that you can just at least find out, is there any data still attached to this particular item that helps me make sense of it? The second is to do the content analysis. So if this is allegedly of a particular town in Syria, is the content within the video consistent with what you would expect to see in that particular region? Or are there really unusual differences, like that kind of tree just wouldn't be in that particular town or whatever? And then the third part is source analysis. So really asking yourself, who posted this? And can I figure that out? And what might have been their motivation for posting it? So I think a lot of the times where people have thankfully not been tripped up by sharing bad information or disinformation was because they took that third step and really said, wait a second, this is a little weird. This person supposedly in this town in Aleppo, supposedly, you know, they put up this video on YouTube, but this is the only video they've ever posted. And, you know, I can't figure out anything about this person, even though this is a, you know, maybe it's in a town that has a lot of presence on Facebook or whatever platform, but you can find nothing else about this human being. Also, are there other videos out there? If this is of a particular event that allegedly happened that maybe involved a number of people, why isn't anyone else capturing it? Of course, we'll have scenarios where there's only likely to be one witness, and that's possible, but these are all questions we can use to interrogate more broadly the veracity of content that we find online.
Thank you so much. I think those tips are really useful. I'd like to ask a question to Afaf. As both a writer and an editor of citizen journalism, what do you see as the primary benefits of the citizen model versus established media outlets?
Well, the citizen model definitely, the sort of positive or like about this model is that it's the reach and the scale. So many people can sort of before with traditional media, it's just a number of people who decide, which stories to tell to their audiences or to the people. But with citizen journalists, a lot of people may have, of course, different interests or different motivations, but at the same time, this allows for more and more people to be able to tell their stories or the stories of those being affected, of their communities, to bring in more voices also from countries and regions and communities that we do not hear about at all, or we mainly hear about only like in conflicts or in wars. But to have like those sort of wide variety of stories, it also gives, it makes those people and those communities sort of more present in the news cycle, not just when there is a conflict. And that helps also, particularly in conflicts and wars. It's sometimes some people or some communities are dehumanized, like are just seen as victims. But when we get to hear about those people just I don't know, living like a normal life or like doing great things, I think it's important.
I want to follow up with this question. It kind of goes off of what you just said, and it might allow you to expand a little more, but how can we avoid sharing or consuming images of human rights violations for shock value or in ways that are disempowering?
So here, I think what matters is context, and context is very important. Just sharing like a shocking video or a graphic video like that, I think itself, it's not enough. I know for some people, like maybe they like that tactic because they think or they believe that shocking content can help people sort of take action. But I don't think that's really, it always works. I think what matters is the context, but also the human stories. I think it's really these people who fall victims to these atrocities, and they are victims to war crimes, of war crimes and human rights violations. They are people with the stories, with entire lives that get sort of destroyed by these violations. I think what we need to do more is to be able to tell more those stories of those victims beyond just what happened to them in this moment where their lives got, really, I don't know, maybe destroyed or and here I think maybe, because I know that part of the question is also about like the bridge between citizen journalism and positive action, but I would like to maybe talk a little bit about the bridge between citizen journalism and maybe independent media or traditional media, because here the role of these media institution is very important, because they can pick up on those stories and they can try to put in more context and try to investigate more what happened with these people, and to once again tell the human stories behind those footage or videos.
Would anyone else like to follow up on that?
I have some thoughts, and I think, definitely I agree with what Afif has said. Context is very key. It's important to always tell the stories and not just put out the video for shock value, because even if you do that over and over again without the context and without the stories of these people whose lives have been violated, people will start to get numb. People will start to lose that initial anger to actually react to human rights atrocities. And we all need that anger to still stay and remain, so that we do not get complacent and so used to human rights atrocities that we just see another video and we're just like, oh, another bombing, or oh, another killing. And just to add on to that, in terms of the bridge that Afef talked about between citizen journalists and traditional media, is the fact that it's a symbiotic relationship. It should be seen as such. And the aim is not to make citizen journalists become professional journalists, in my own opinion, because then are you going to start making sure that everybody who whips out their phone or camera has an identification? Otherwise, we do not want to over-regulate it, because that is what you have for professional journalism, even though we want to have there to be standards, because we still want that space to be fluid and for people to be able to document instantaneously, but of course effectively at the same time.
If I can add one more thing to that, also, I 100% agree with everything that both of my co-panelists have just said. I also think it's really important to ask, if you're resharing something on social media, who are you potentially harming? So in the aftermath of the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, a year and a half or 2 years ago, that particular massacre was live streamed. A lot of people were accidental witnesses to that live stream and had serious psychological ramifications afterward from their witnessing of that particular event. And I'm very concerned sometimes with the retweeting or the reposting of a particular moment that's such an atrocity. Who might be seeing this and be ultimately impacted in a negative way by the actual viewing itself? So sometimes there might be ways to communicate the information that are exposing people less to the risks of that, but having even greater impact. So I think another piece is thinking through who is actually in a position to do something about this that I may have access to and that people on the ground may not. So where can I lend weight to what it is they're trying to make happen? And for those of us in the United States, for example, it might be, we need the US government to put more pressure on another government to stop a particular abuse. And can I get it to my elected official? And can I start just getting so much noise made about this that they start making it a priority to actually be thinking about this and talking about this? And then the last thing I might say is that, I think depression, one of the things that a lot of psychologists have pointed out and psychiatrists is that depression also often stems from a lack of hope. So I think thinking through critically when we're working with this really difficult material, how can we give an even greater sense of meaning to our engagement, and therefore a sense of hope that we are actually in a position where we can help make change happen? And that often is more than just a reflexive reposting. And it may actually be about talking in your community about what strategies we can use. And then again, if you're outside the area of conflict and not as intimate with it, how do we make sure that what we do next is being driven by and truly responsive to what people closest to that site are actually saying they want to have occur?
Thank you all for these great thoughts. I think it's really nice for us as social media users to have a way to interact with citizen media in a positive way, and not necessarily have to rely on companies, social media companies, and governments to do that work for us. So we are almost out of time, but I'd like to wrap up with just one question for each of you. In 30 seconds or one tweet, what is the main message that you would like our audience to take away from this conversation? And Adebayo, I'll start with you.
Okay, I don't think this can fit into a tweet because it's just 240 characters, but I can do it in 30 seconds, I'll try. So just the same way that it was said that video and film brought the Holocaust into the courtroom at the Nuremberg trial and changed how people reacted to that trial. I want to say that those who are there constantly filming and documenting should know that their videos do make a difference. It does count. And it might take a while for justice and accountability to occur or to happen, but they should not lose hope. I think that sliver of hope is very key to let us know that it might take 10 years, like in the case of many cases we know about, like Thomas Lubanga, but it would eventually happen if we can make sure we document that evidence of atrocity. So keep filming, essentially.
Thank you. I'll move to FF and then Alexa.
Thanks. So yeah, it's a lot to summarize, but I think from my background in working at the intersection of technology and human rights, I think it's important to continue critically debating the role social media plays in journalism in general and citizen journalism. What it entails to rely on commercial tools that do not put human rights first, and what the implications are and might be, and what can be done about that.
And I would maybe just add to it, speaking to legal investigators and the legal community, to maximize impact, it's really critical to be structured and to use a process when working with digital content. It's so easy for biases to be introduced into this space to influence what we see, what we have access to, and what we amplify, and also to know what we can have confidence in as being reliable to courts of law. That I think if we do go through these protocols and these careful steps, we make sure that ultimately the voices of those closest to atrocity have the greatest weight and the greatest potential for actually having impact.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for such a thought-provoking conversation. And thank you, of course, to the Berkeley Journal of International Law for hosting this conversation. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. If you want to learn more about our panelists, just visit globalspeechnderpressure.com. And obviously, please tune in to our next panel and to our events continuing tomorrow. Thank you so much.